Hey guys. Tonight we slip quietly into a version of Victorian Britain that smells faintly of coal smoke, polished wood, and very expensive perfume trying a little too hard to hide something else. You're standing outside a palace that looks solid, moral, and absolutely convinced of its own righteousness. Gas lamps glow like watchful eyes. Carriages roll past with the confidence of people who assume history will be kind to them. You, however, already sense that behind those thick stone walls are lives knotted together in ways no etiquette manual could ever untangle. Honestly, if you had to live under this much social pressure, you probably wouldn't survive a week. Your group chat would give you away by Tuesday. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk forward, metaphorically of course, into the age that preached restraint while quietly practicing contradiction. Victorian Britain loved rules the way modern people love password managers, obsessively. And mostly because everything would fall apart without them. Publicly, the royal family was the moral thermostat of the nation, setting the tone for what was decent, proper, and acceptable. Privately, things were warmer, much warmer. You feel it immediately, like stepping into a drawing room where the windows are closed and everyone insists the air is perfectly fine. One of the most familiar historical facts you already know is that Queen Victoria herself became a symbol of domestic virtue, wife, mother, widow, and moral compass for an empire. Her long marriage to Prince Albert was held up as proof that love, fidelity, and monarchy could coexist beautifully. You've seen the portraits, stiff posture, solemn eyes, lace and medals arranged just so. Yet as you drift through these early years, you begin to notice how much effort went into maintaining that image. The court did not merely live morality, it staged it, rehearsed it, and lit it carefully from flattering angles. Here's a lesser-known truth that hums beneath the floorboards. The Victorian court was crowded with people whose job titles didn't quite match their real responsibilities. Ladies-in-waiting, equerries, private secretaries, roles that placed them close enough to power to hear breathing change, to notice glances lingered too long, to understand when a door was closed for reasons that had nothing to do with drafts. You can almost hear the soft rustle of silk as someone pauses outside a corridor, pretending not to listen while memorizing every sound. As you move room to room, you realize how secrecy functioned like a second language. Notes were passed that said everything by saying almost nothing. She is resting could mean illness, exhaustion, or something far more complicated. The child will be cared for elsewhere, carried a weight that settled heavily in the chest. Modern ears might translate these phrases instantly, but in their own time, they floated safely above scandal, protected by class and custom. There's a strange sensory calm to it all. The ticking of clocks, the low murmur of conversation, the scratch of a pen on paper. You imagine how exhausting it must have been to maintain not just appearances, but entire parallel realities. Think of it like running two social media accounts at once, one pristine, one hidden, and never, ever posting to the wrong one. Some historians still debate how consciously this system was maintained from the top down, or whether it simply evolved because everyone benefited from not asking certain questions. You pause near a window and look out over the city. London stretches endlessly, filled with people who believed the monarchy embodied stability and virtue. That belief mattered. It kept factories humming, colonies obedient, and newspapers polite. Which brings us to another well-known event woven quietly into this atmosphere: the rapid expansion of the press. Victorian newspapers thrived on gossip. Yet royal scandal rarely made it to print. This wasn't ignorance, it was restraint. Sometimes voluntary, sometimes encouraged. Editors knew which stories would sell, and which would end careers. Silence, in this case, was a business decision. A curious, often overlooked fact is how frequently rumors were allowed to circulate just enough to release pressure, but never enough to explode. A whisper here, a knowing look there. You can almost compare it to vague celebrity blinds today. Everyone suspects. No one confirms, and life moves on. The difference is that here, inheritance, legitimacy, and national identity were all at stake. The stakes weren't just emotional, they were constitutional. As you continue walking, you notice children, some laughing openly in nurseries, others existing only as lines in ledgers or beneficiaries of discrete financial arrangements. Official heirs were celebrated, photographed, and educated for destiny. Unofficial ones were managed. They were placed with trusted families, sent abroad, or supported quietly through allowances that appeared in budgets without explanation. The existence of such arrangements is historically acknowledged, but the identities involved remain hazy. Once again, historians still debate the extent to which the royal household actively orchestrated these solutions versus simply allowing them to happen. What strikes you most is how normalized all of this feels within the walls. No gasps, no dramatic confrontations, just routines, breakfast trays, afternoon walks, evening music. Scandal, when handled correctly, did not look like chaos. It looked like administration, and that may be the most unsettling realization of all. You slow your pace, feeling the weight of contradiction settle gently around you. This era preached purity while perfecting discretion. It demanded self-control while inventing elaborate methods to bypass it. And as you stand there, listening to the distant echo of footsteps on marble floors, you understand that these stories are not about shock or outrage. They are about human behavior under impossible expectations. About what happens when image becomes more valuable than truth. The lights dim slightly now. Not because anyone turned them down, but because your mind is adjusting. The palace is still. For the moment, the secrets are still safe. And you sense that this is only the beginning. The outermost layer of a story that will grow quieter, stranger, and far more intimate as you continue forward. Step by careful step, into the Victorian night. You don't notice the shift at first. The palace feels the same: polished floors, controlled voices, that gentle hum of order pretending to be permanence. But as you move deeper, the air subtly changes, like a room where a conversation has just stopped. This is where Prince Albert lives, not in the portraits or public memory, but in the quieter spaces between letters, schedules, and expectations. You already know the broad, respectable facts. Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Devoted husband to Queen Victoria. Reform-minded. Industrious. The very model of a modern royal consort. History books adore him. Monuments insist on his virtue. But as you linger here, you begin to sense that devotion, like everything else in this era, carried a private cost. You walk alongside the rhythm of Albert's daily life, one that looks almost aggressively productive. Committees, memoranda, architectural plans, educational reforms. He works the way some people scroll endlessly today, constantly. Perhaps to avoid sitting still with certain thoughts. One well-known historical reality is that Albert involved himself deeply in governance despite having no constitutional authority. He advised, organized, corrected, and supervised. Victoria relied on him utterly, emotionally and intellectually. Their letters overflow with affection, dependence, and intensity. You can almost hear her voice echoing in the halls, sharp with need, softened by trust. Yet here's a quieter truth that rarely makes it into celebratory biographies. Albert was often deeply unhappy. The role of consort left him powerful without control, visible without autonomy. You imagine what that feels like, being essential but never fully sovereign. Add to that a court environment saturated with temptation, proximity, and silence, and you begin to understand why rumors clustered around him like dust motes in afternoon light. As you pass a writing desk, you notice stacks of correspondence. Albert wrote constantly, sometimes obsessively, as if paper could absorb anxiety. Some letters survived, others did not. Victoria herself destroyed many after his death. A well-documented act of grief and control. This alone sparks debate. Was she protecting privacy, preserving an image, or erasing ambiguities she could no longer bear to hold? Historians still debate the motivation behind her editorial hand, especially given how carefully she curated Albert's posthumous reputation. There were whispers even during his lifetime, never loud, never official. Close friendships with young men raised eyebrows in an era that both obsessed over and refused to name certain desires. Intense emotional bonds, shared residences during travel, language in letters that feels, to modern readers, unusually intimate. None of this proves anything definitive. And certainty would be a modern imposition on a different emotional vocabulary. Still, you can feel how the court noticed patterns, even if it lacked the words to frame them. Silence, once again, does a lot of work. Then there are the women, ladies in waiting, aristocratic guests, wives of trusted officials, no confirmed affairs, no undeniable evidence, but proximity has a way of generating stories all on its own. Albert was handsome, foreign, and intellectually intense. He also lived in a world where separation between public duty and private feeling was thin at best. The fact that no scandal ever erupted may say less about innocence and more about efficiency. Victorian scandal didn't require purity, it required containment. You pause near a mirror and catch your own reflection, momentarily disoriented by the thought that even the most idealized royal marriage was under constant strain. Victoria adored Albert with a fervor that bordered on dependence. Her letters oscillate between devotion and possessiveness, love and anxiety. She worried about his loyalty, his health, his moods. Some modern readers might jokingly diagnose attachment styles here. But you remind yourself, gently, that this was a partnership forged under relentless scrutiny. Every emotion had an audience, even when expressed privately. A lesser-known detail floats up as you continue. Albert kept careful records of household expenses, including allowances that were never publicly explained. Money moved quietly, predictably, without headlines. It's impossible to say exactly what all of it covered, but its existence hints at a system designed to solve problems before they acquired names. Again, historians still debate whether these payments reflect charitable habits, extended family obligations, or something more discreet. Outside the palace, the public image held firm. Albert was the stabilizing force behind Victoria's reign, the moral anchor of a rapidly industrializing empire. When the Great Exhibition opened in 1851, a famous historical milestone, you can almost feel Albert's pride humming through the Crystal Palace itself. Progress, order, rationality, this was his vision of the future. And yet, even as crowds marveled at machinery and glass, Albert's private correspondence reveals exhaustion, frustration, and a sense of isolation that no exhibition could dispel. You imagine the contradiction settling into his bones. To be admired yet constrained, loved yet watched, trusted yet rumored about. It's the kind of pressure that doesn't explode, it compresses. And compression, as you know from modern life, leads to strange internal negotiations. What can be expressed? What must be buried? What is allowed only in thought? Albert's early death from illness, another well-known historical fact, froze his image permanently. He never lived long enough to be publicly disappointing. Victoria's grief transformed him into a saint, an icon of virtue beyond question. This sanctification, while emotionally sincere, also flattened complexity. It left little room for ambiguity. And ambiguity is exactly where the most human stories tend to live. You sense that now, standing in the stillness he left behind. The doubts were never resolved, they were simply outlived. The rumors were never confirmed, they were just buried under mourning and marble. And perhaps that's why they linger. When questions are denied answers, they don't disappear, they wait. As you move on, the palace seems to exhale softly. Like it's relieved you didn't ask anything too directly. You didn't accuse. You didn't confirm. You simply noticed. And in this world, noticing is already a quiet act of rebellion. The footsteps ahead draw you onward, toward other rooms, other lives, and secrets less protected by love, but just as carefully guarded by silence. You feel the shift again. Softer this time, as if the palace itself is lowering its voice. This is not the realm of monarchs or consorts, but of the people who move around them so smoothly they almost vanish. Servants, footmen, ladies' maids, you step into their world now, where corridors are narrower, ceilings lower, and the air carries the mixed scents of soap, starch, and secrets that don't belong to the people who keep them. If the royal family is the face of Victorian respectability, these are the eyes and ears, present for everything, credited for nothing. One widely accepted historical reality is that the Victorian royal household was enormous and meticulously structured. Hundreds of staff lived in close proximity to the family. Often for decades, they dressed them, woke them, cleaned up after them, and watched them at their most unguarded. You can't help but think how impossible true privacy would be under those conditions. Even today, with locked phones and white noise machines. Secrets leak. Here, they practically seeped into the walls. You walked past a group of servants pretending very hard not to notice each other. Conversation here is a dangerous luxury. Words can travel faster than footsteps. And a misplaced sentence can cost a livelihood. And yet, information circulates anyway. A glance held too long. A bedroom light extinguished at an unusual hour. A child who appears suddenly and is never mentioned again. You sense how the staff learned to read these signs with the precision of weather forecasters. They didn't need explanations, patterns were enough. A lesser-known truth emerges as you linger. Royal servants were often bound by informal but powerful codes of silence. While some signed written agreements, most relied on social pressure and economic fear. Serving the crown came with prestige, housing, and security, things not easily replaced. Breaking confidence didn't just end a job, it ended a life path. Historians still debate how much this silence was enforced through explicit threats versus quietly understood consequences. But the result was the same. Discretion became instinct. You pause near a service staircase and hear laughter, quick, hushed, and gone. Even here, humor survives. It has to. Servants joked among themselves in ways their employers never could. Dark jokes, ironic jokes, the kind that keep you sane when you know far too much about people who will never know your name. Imagine managing today's celebrity scandals while living in the same house as the celebrities. And you start to get the idea. One familiar historical event flickers through this space: the frequent royal tours and extended stays at country estates. These were presented publicly as wholesome retreats, fresh air, family time, a break from London. For servants, they meant disruption and opportunity. New locations loosened routines. Temporary staff were hired. Old hierarchies blurred just enough for things to happen that would never dare occur in Buckingham Palace. Country houses had corners, gardens, night air that encouraged risk. Here's a detail often overlooked: mid-level servants, not the highest-ranking ones, knew the most. They moved freely but weren't visible enough to attract attention. A valet fetching clothing at the wrong hour. A maid assigned suddenly to a different wing. These were the people who noticed patterns without being noticed themselves. Some kept mental inventories of what they'd seen. Others wrote private diaries that surfaced decades later. Heavily edited, cautious even in hindsight. You feel the strange moral calculus of their position. Loyalty versus truth. Survival versus integrity. It wasn't that servants were immoral, they were practical. When a discreet situation arose, an unplanned pregnancy, an inconvenient attachment, the household closed ranks. Arrangements were made. A servant might be reassigned, dismissed with a generous reference, or sent abroad. A baby might be described as belonging to a distant cousin or a trusted employee. The story mattered less than its plausibility. Historians still debate how often servants actively facilitated affairs versus merely adapting to them. Did they deliver messages knowingly? Arrange schedules deliberately? Or did they simply follow instructions without asking why? The evidence is frustratingly indirect, filtered through memoirs written long after the fact. But you can sense that in an environment this intimate, neutrality itself becomes a form of participation. You drift toward the kitchens, where warmth and noise soften the edges of secrecy. This is where rumors ferment. Not shouted, not confirmed, just floated gently. Like steam rising from a pot. A name mentioned, then quickly corrected. A knowing smile. Nothing that could ever be repeated upstairs. These rumors didn't aim to expose, they aimed to explain. Humans, after all, dislike gaps in narrative. What strikes you most is how the servants' knowledge never translated into power. They knew who loved who visited which room, who paid for what to disappear. Yet they remained invisible. Modern culture loves the idea of the whistleblower, the tell-all memoir, the explosive reveal. Victorian servants lived in a different reality. Silence was not just safer, it was virtuous. Loyalty, even to flawed masters, was a moral achievement. You take a slow breath and notice how tired this makes you feel. Even as an observer, carrying secrets that aren't yours, guarding reputations that don't benefit you. And still, there is pride here, pride in professionalism, in being trusted, even indirectly, in knowing the truth and choosing, day after day, not to speak it. As you leave this quieter, narrower world behind, you realize something subtle but important. The scandals of the Victorian royals were never just personal failures. They were collaborative constructions, maintained by dozens of people who understood that stability mattered more than honesty. The palace doesn't scold you for noticing this. It simply keeps breathing, slow and steady, as if reminding you that the next layer of the story waits just ahead, less invisible. Perhaps, but no less carefully arranged. You step back into wider corridors now, where the ceilings rise again and confidence returns to people's posture. This is the world of the gentlemen, princes, dukes, favored sons, and titled men who wore respectability like a tailored coat. From a distance, they look consistent, even predictable. Morning duties, afternoon appearances, evening dinners. But you've learned enough by now to recognize that consistency here is a performance, not a condition. And as you walk alongside these men, you begin to sense how many of them lived two lives without ever thinking of themselves as dishonest. A familiar historical truth settles in first. Victorian masculinity prized restraint, duty, and authority. A gentleman was expected to govern his household, his impulses, and, by extension, his nation. Publicly, these men embodied control. Privately, they were human, and humanity has a way of slipping its leash. The contradiction wasn't seen as hypocrisy so much as necessity. Desire existed. The trick was to keep it from interfering with responsibility. Think of it as a very early version of work-life balance. Except the consequences were dynastic. You walked past a row of portraits, all stern gazes and heroic poses. None of them show the late nights, the discreet addresses, the carefully timed absences. One lesser-known fact becomes clear as you linger. Many elite Victorian men believed that emotional fidelity and physical fidelity were not the same thing. Love belonged at home. Indiscretions, if managed quietly, belonged elsewhere. This logic wasn't written down, but it was widely practiced. Historians still debate how consciously this double standard was articulated versus simply absorbed from social norms. Clubs play a central role here. Gentlemen's clubs, another well-documented feature of Victorian life, offered privacy disguised as respectability. You imagine heavy doors closing, cigars glowing, voices lowering. These spaces were not necessarily sites of scandal themselves, but they were hubs of coordination. Information moved here, introductions were made, problems were solved, if something needed to disappear. This was where the plan likely began. No paper trail, just understanding. As you drift through one such room, you notice how easily humor fills the gaps. Light jokes, raised eyebrows, the kind of banter that says everything while committing to nothing. It's surprisingly modern. You can almost hear someone today saying, "Well, that's complicated," and changing the subject. Back then, the phrase might have been, "He has his arrangements," delivered with a sigh and a sip of brandy. There's an odd calm to these men. They aren't reckless, they're efficient. Affairs, when they happened, were structured around predictability, regular schedules, trusted intermediaries, financial allowances that appear boring on paper. This is where the system you've already noticed becomes more visible. Discretion isn't a moral stance, it's a logistical skill. And many of these gentlemen were very good at logistics. A lesser-known but revealing detail surfaces here. Some royal and aristocratic men acknowledged their illegitimate children privately, even affectionately, while denying them publicly. Letters survive, carefully phrased, emotionally restrained, offering guidance, money, and concern without names or titles. These children grew up aware of who their fathers were, yet also aware of who they could never be. Historians still debate whether this half-recognition was an act of kindness or cruelty. And you can feel how the answer depends on where you stand. Marriage, in this context, becomes something like a stable headquarters. Wives were partners in status, managers of households, producers of legitimate heirs. Many knew more than history gives them credit for. Silence wasn't always ignorance, sometimes it was negotiation. You imagine the quiet agreements that must have existed. Unspoken but firm, boundaries drawn not in words, but in expectations. Don't embarrass me. Don't endanger the line. Don't make me see it. You feel a brief chill as you realize how lonely this arrangement could be for everyone involved. The men compartmentalized. The wives endured. The mistresses existed in shadows. The children hovered between worlds. And all of it was held together by routine. Breakfast at the same hour. Church on the same day. Portraits hung symmetrically on the wall. Order as anesthesia. One well-known historical scandal flickers at the edge of this world, not yet named, not yet exploded. You can sense how close some of these double lives came to public collapse. A mistimed letter, a jealous lover, an illness that required inconvenient explanations. Each near miss reinforced the system's discipline. Survival bred refinement. You notice, too, how rarely guilt appears in these spaces. Concern, yes. Anxiety, certainly. But guilt implies a violation of internal values. And many of these men didn't see themselves as violating anything essential. Duty was fulfilled. The realm was stable. The heir was produced. What happened in the margins felt secondary. Modern judgment might bristle at this logic. But you remind yourself, softly, that moral frameworks shift over time. Even when behavior stays stubbornly the same. As you move on, the echoes of polished shoes fade behind you. The double lives remain intact, humming along smoothly. Fueled by confidence and reinforced by silence. You understand now that scandal in Victorian royal life wasn't born from passion alone. It emerged when systems failed. And for the moment, at least, these systems are still working quietly, efficiently, as you continue deeper into the story, toward the people who paid the highest price for that efficiency. You slow your pace without meaning to, as if the palace itself is asking for a gentler step. This is where the women live, not the queens immortalized in marble or the debutantes frozen in formal portraits. But the others, the ones who appear only at the edges of official memory. You can feel their presence in the quieter rooms, in the upholstered chairs that have listened to more confessions than any priest. History remembers Victorian women as symbols, virtue, patience, ornament, but here, you begin to sense how incomplete that picture really is. One well-known historical reality is that women of the royal and aristocratic world were expected to embody moral stability. Their behavior reflected not just on themselves, but on husbands, fathers, and entire bloodlines. A single rumor could collapse marriage prospects, alliances, even careers. You feel the weight of that expectation settle over these rooms like heavy drapery. And yet, despite the risks, desire, loneliness, and ambition found their way in. They always do. You pass a row of portraits, elegant gowns, composed expressions, eyes trained never to reveal too much. But portraits lie by design. They flatten lives into symbolism. A lesser-known truth emerges when you linger long enough. Many of these women kept private journals that told a very different story. Written in careful code, in foreign languages, or with deliberate vagueness, these diaries reveal emotional intensity, resentment, longing, and sometimes joy that had no acceptable outlet. Historians still debate how representative these surviving texts are, but even a few are enough to crack the surface. Some women entered affairs not out of recklessness, but calculation. Marriage was often arranged for title, money, or politics, not compatibility. Emotional intimacy, when absent at home, was sought elsewhere. You imagine the careful risk assessment that preceded every choice. Who can be trusted? Who talks too much? Which glance is safe? And which could ruin everything? It's less romantic than novels suggest. More like a constant low-level strategic game. Think chess, but with your reputation as the board. You notice how illness appears frequently in these stories. Delicate health becomes a socially acceptable explanation for withdrawal, absence, or sudden travel. A woman disappears from court for months, returns quieter, thinner, changed. Officially, nothing has happened. Unofficially, everyone understands that something has been survived. Pregnancy outside marriage was a crisis managed with speed and discretion. Country estates, foreign tours, and extended convalescence absorbed realities that could not be named. Here's a detail that rarely makes headlines. Women were often the ones who arranged their own erasure. Faced with impossible consequences, they negotiated silence as a form of agency. A child placed elsewhere. A relationship ended without explanation. A letter burned. Modern eyes might read this as oppression alone. But you sense something more complicated, adaptation within constraint. Historians still debate whether these acts represent empowerment or resignation. And the answer, unhelpfully, is often both. You drift toward a sitting room where lace curtains soften the light. This is where conversations happen sideways. Compliments layered over warnings. Advice disguised as gossip. Older women, especially, play a quiet role here, mentors in survival. They know the rules because they've already broken them, or come close enough to feel the heat. Be careful can mean 1,000 different things, depending on tone. There's a faint humor in it, too, a dry, self-aware wit that surfaces in letters and marginal notes. Jokes about nerves or overexertion that clearly mean something else. You smile softly at this, recognizing the same coping mechanism people use today, irony as insulation. Even under rigid morality, people found ways to acknowledge reality without inviting disaster. Publicly, these women remained immaculate. Charity events, family gatherings, church appearances, the performance never stopped. And yet, in private, the emotional labor was immense. Loving discreetly, losing quietly, raising children who could never call them by the right name in public. You feel how exhausting this must have been, how sleep itself might have become difficult under the weight of constant self-editing. One familiar historical theme threads through here. When scandal did break, women paid more dearly, men recovered, titles endured, reputations, once cracked, could often be patched. Women, however, were remembered for the breach alone. This imbalance shaped behavior profoundly. Risk was calculated differently when the penalty was permanent exile from respectability. As you leave these rooms, the air feels heavier, not with drama, but with endurance. These stories are not loud. They don't demand outrage. They ask for attention. You realize that without these women managing consequences, absorbing blame, maintaining continuity, the system you've been observing could not function. Their silence was not empty. It was structural. The palace does not acknowledge this contribution. It never has. But as you move on, carrying the echo of their restrained laughter and unrecorded choices, you sense that the next part of the story will bring those silences into sharper focus, where consequences take form, and where the quiet decisions of today become the unresolved questions of tomorrow. You notice the temperature change before anything else. The rooms feel smaller again, not physically, but emotionally, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath. This is where the children exist, or rather, where some of them don't. The acknowledged heirs move openly through brightly lit corridors, supervised, documented, endlessly prepared for futures already written for them. But you are drawn instead to the absences, the gaps in family trees, the lives that unfold just outside the frame of official memory. A well-known historical fact anchors you here. Lineage mattered more in Victorian royal life than almost anything else. Bloodlines justified power, stabilized succession, and reassured a public deeply invested in order. Legitimacy was not just a legal status, it was a moral one. And yet, despite all precautions, children were born who did not fit neatly into the system. Their existence did not surprise anyone. What mattered was how efficiently they could be folded out of sight. You imagine the moment of realization, the quiet calculations made behind closed doors. A pregnancy that cannot be explained. A timeline that doesn't align. From that moment on, speed becomes essential. Doctors are summoned, trusted advisors consulted, plans assembled with astonishing calm. A lesser-known truth surfaces here. Many of these arrangements were prepared in advance. Almost like emergency protocols, The system did not improvise, it activated. You walk past a nursery that looks perfectly ordinary. Then another that feels strangely underused. Some children were raised as wards, companions, or the children of distant relatives. Others were placed with loyal servants or discreet families far from court. Financial support followed quietly, delivered through intermediaries and allowances that appeared dutiful rather than suspicious. Historians still debate how many such children existed within royal and aristocratic circles. Precisely because the system worked so well, successful secrecy leaves very little evidence. What stays with you is the emotional ambiguity. These children were not always abandoned in the modern sense. Some were visited, some received letters, gifts, even guidance, just never recognition. Imagine growing up knowing exactly who your parent is, yet understanding that speaking the truth aloud would damage everyone involved, including yourself. It's a peculiar form of intimacy, defined entirely by limits. You notice how language softens reality here. Taken care of, provided for, well placed. These phrases appear again and again in correspondence. Doing heavy emotional labor while pretending to be administrative. They reassure everyone involved that the situation is under control, even if no one asks what control costs. Historians still debate whether such euphemisms reflect compassion or avoidance. And you sense that the answer depends on which letter you're reading. And who wrote it? There's a faint echo of normal childhood in these spaces, lessons, walks, birthdays marked quietly rather than publicly. Some illegitimate children grew up remarkably well educated, supported just enough to ensure comfort without visibility. Others felt the limits more sharply, hitting invisible ceilings they could never quite explain. Opportunity hovered close, always just out of reach, like a locked door with familiar handwriting on the key. You find yourself comparing this to modern conversations about identity and belonging. Today, we talk openly, sometimes painfully, about recognition and truth. In Victorian Britain, truth was negotiable. Stability was the priority. The emotional well-being of a child ranked below the smooth continuation of the public narrative. That sounds harsh when stated plainly. And perhaps it should. But as you stand here, you also feel how normalized it was. This wasn't cruelty in the eyes of the time, it was management. One particularly strange, rarely discussed detail surfaces as you linger. Some of these children were quietly guided into careers that kept them near. But not too near, military posts abroad, colonial administration, clergy, lives of service that mirrored proximity without claiming inheritance. Historians still debate whether this represented opportunity or exile. And again, the answer seems to shift depending on the outcome. You sense the emotional weight settling now. Heavier than before. These are not scandal stories meant to shock. They are quiet compromises lived over decades. Children who learned early which questions not to ask. Parents who learned how to love within margins. Families who functioned smoothly because certain truths remained permanently unfinished. As you move on, the corridors lengthen again, as if offering space to breathe. But the feeling doesn't lift. You carry it with you. The understanding that behind every polished lineage lies a constellation of almosts and never quites. The system didn't erase these children, it blurred them. And blurred figures have a way of haunting the edges of history. Ahead, You sense a different kind of evidence waiting, not people, but paper, letters, records, fragments that survived despite every effort to make them vanish. The palace doesn't resist you now. It simply opens the next door, quietly, and lets you step inside. The door closes behind you with a sound that feels softer than it should. As if even wood has learned discretion here. This room smells faintly of paper and dust, ink and time. You're surrounded now by what survived, the letters that weren't burned, the diaries that escaped editing, the documents that slipped through gaps in intention. Paper is fragile, but it's also stubborn. It waits, and as you move closer, you can feel how much effort went into making sure these words were never meant for you. One well-established historical reality is that Victorian elites wrote obsessively. Letters were the bloodstream of relationships, politics, and daily life, before phones, before messages that vanished instantly. Every feeling had to pass through ink. This created a strange paradox, a culture desperate for privacy that produced mountains of written evidence. You can almost sense the tension in the handwriting, careful phrasing, pauses mid-sentence, sudden changes in tone when something dangerous approached. You pick up a letter. Metaphorically, of course. It begins politely. Weather, health, a shared acquaintance. Then, without ever naming the thing it's about, it circles closer. Words like regret, arrangements, and circumstances appear, doing the work of entire conversations. A lesser-known truth becomes clear here. Victorian writers were masters of implication. They trusted the reader to understand what was not said. In fact, saying too much would have been the greater risk. You notice how often letters refer to other letters that no longer exist. As I wrote before, burn this when read. You know what I mean. These absences are as loud as any confession. Historians still debate whether missing correspondence was destroyed systematically or selectively. But you can feel intention in the gaps. Someone decided which truths could survive and which could not. Diaries are even stranger. They feel private, yet many are written with an imagined future reader in mind. A daughter, perhaps, a historian, or simply posterity itself. Some entries are brutally honest, recording emotional storms that had no safe outlet elsewhere. Others are frustratingly vague, noting that today was difficult without explanation. You get the sense that even alone with themselves, some writers hesitated. Self-censorship becomes habit when practiced daily. A well-known historical practice surfaces here. After Prince Albert's death, Queen Victoria edited his letters extensively before publication. This was framed as devotion, and undoubtedly much of it was. But editing is also shaping. She removed anything that might complicate his image or their marriage. You feel the quiet power of that act, grief and authority intertwined. Historians still debate whether this was an act of love, control, or both, and the debate itself has become part of Albert's legacy. You drift toward a stack of documents that feel more official: medical notes, household accounts, travel arrangements. These rarely mention scandal directly, but they hint constantly. Sudden relocations, payments to unnamed recipients, doctor's visits recorded with unusual frequency, a stay recommended for health that aligns too neatly with other events. It's like reading a spreadsheet that quietly tells a story its creator never intended. One particularly curious detail stands out: handwriting analysis. Modern scholars have noticed moments where scripts change abruptly within the same letter, tighter, smaller, more controlled. Stress made itself visible. Ink pressure deepened. Lines slanted differently. The body, it seems, betrayed truths the words refused to state. Historians still debate how much weight to give such evidence. But it's hard not to feel its presence when you imagine the pen pressing harder at certain moments. There's something almost tender about these fragments. They were never meant to be weapons. Most were written to manage feelings, not expose them. I trust your discretion. This must go no further. These phrases appear again and again, like small prayers. You can't help but smile faintly at how human it all is. People hoping paper will obey them. Spoiler alert, it rarely does. You compare this to modern life, where deleting a message feels decisive, final. Victorian writers had no such illusion. Once ink dried, it existed in the world. Drawers could be locked, fires lit, editors employed, but nothing was guaranteed. The survival of these documents feels almost accidental. And yet, here they are, reshaping how we understand an entire era. As you step back, the room seems fuller now, crowded with voices that never meant to speak to you. They don't shout, they don't accuse, they murmur, they complicate, and in doing so, they make the scandals feel less like dramatic ruptures and more like slow leaks, managed, patched, and lived with. You leave the papers where they are. They've already done enough. Ahead, you sense the story widening again, moving beyond Britain's walls, where rumors traveled faster and discretion became harder to control. The palace doesn't follow you there. It simply lets the door close softly behind you, trusting that what you've read will linger as you continue on. The space you enter next feels unexpectedly clinical. Less velvet, more porcelain. The air smells faintly of antiseptic and something herbal. An attempt at reassurance rather than effectiveness. This is the domain of doctors and midwives, figures who carried immense authority precisely because they were supposed to be neutral. You sense immediately how much trust was placed in them, and how much silence that trust required in return. A well-known historical reality grounds you here. Victorian medicine was advancing rapidly, yet remained deeply entangled with social hierarchy. Royal and aristocratic physicians occupied a unique position. They were professionals, yes, but also confidants. They knew bodies, schedules, symptoms, and timelines. In cases involving pregnancy, illness, or nervous conditions, their assessments could shape entire narratives. You can almost feel the weight of that responsibility pressing into the floorboards. You pause beside a neatly arranged desk. Medical notes sit stacked, written in careful, impersonal language. Fatigue, rest required, change of air advised. These phrases appear again and again, serving as official explanations for events that needed polite cover. A lesser-known truth emerges here. Doctors were often instrumental in crafting socially acceptable stories. They didn't just treat patients, they treated situations. Historians still debate how ethically this role was understood at the time. But the pattern is unmistakable. Midwives, in particular, occupied a delicate position. They moved between worlds, intimate enough to know the truth, invisible enough to be ignored afterward. When discretion was needed, they were chosen carefully, often through long chains of recommendation. You imagine how quietly their names were passed. How reputation mattered more than credentials. A trusted midwife didn't ask questions. Or rather, she knew which ones not to ask. There's an odd professionalism to it all. Emergencies were handled calmly. Timelines adjusted. A birth that couldn't happen here happened elsewhere. The language never accused. It soothed. Even now, reading between the lines, you can feel how carefully reality was softened. Pregnancy outside marriage wasn't framed as scandal. It was framed as a logistical inconvenience. Solve it. Move on. One strange and rarely discussed detail surfaces as you linger. Some physicians kept parallel records, one official, one private. The official notes stayed bland and vague. The private ones, sometimes coded, captured details meant only for the doctor's memory. Few of these survived, but references to them appear in correspondence. Historians still debate whether these private notes were ethical safeguards or personal insurance policies. But either way, they reveal how much doctors understood the stakes. You notice how illness itself becomes a narrative tool. Victorian society was deeply familiar with frailty. A delicate constitution could justify months of absence without suspicion. Women, especially, were diagnosed with conditions that conveniently required removal from public view. Men, too, could retreat under the banner of exhaustion or overwork. Health provided cover without accusation. It was the perfect explanation, sympathetic, respectable, and unquestionable. There's a faint, uncomfortable humor in it, if you allow yourself to see it. Today, we joke about vague sick days and personal reasons. The Victorians elevated that impulse into an art form. Entire lives could pivot on a doctor's phrasing. A single line in a medical report could preserve a reputation or quietly redirect a future. You feel the ethical tension humming beneath the calm. Were these doctors complicit in deception? Or were they protecting their patients from a society that left no room for error? The answer refuses to settle. Historians still debate the balance between care and concealment. And you sense that each case lived somewhere different along that spectrum. As you move on, the clinical neatness begins to fade. You carry with you the understanding that scandal didn't survive on secrecy alone. It survived because respected professionals helped translate reality into something socially survivable. Medicine, in this context, wasn't just about health, it was about managing truth. The corridor ahead feels longer, more exposed. You sense that the story is about to leave these controlled interiors and step into the wider world, where whispers grow louder. And not everyone agrees to stay quiet. The calm hum behind you softens, replaced by the distant murmur of voices that don't belong to the palace at all. You hear the noise before you see it, a low, restless murmur that doesn't belong to servants or courtiers. This sound comes from outside, from the street, from print shops and coffeehouses and newsrooms thick with ink and opinion. You've stepped into the world of the Victorian press, a place that knew far more than it ever admitted. The air here feels sharper, charged with curiosity held just barely in check. One widely accepted historical fact frames this space. The 19th century saw an explosion of newspapers, pamphlets, and serialized writing. Literacy rose. Printing got cheaper. Public appetite for information became ravenous. And yet, when it came to the royal family, something curious happened. Stories stopped short. Names were omitted, details blurred. It wasn't ignorance, it was restraint. You can almost feel editors leaning back in their chairs, deciding which truths were profitable and which were dangerous. You drift past a printing press. Its rhythm steady and confident. Papers roll out by the hundreds, filled with political debate, social commentary, even moral outrage. Just not the kind that pointed upward. A lesser-known truth surfaces here. Many journalists were perfectly aware of royal indiscretions. Letters circulated, tips arrived, observations were shared in private clubs and correspondence. But printing such things was another matter entirely. Laws around libel were strict. Yes, but social pressure mattered just as much. Access could be revoked. Careers could stall. Silence was often the smarter business model. You notice how language becomes a tool of suggestion rather than accusation. Articles reference certain circles, well-placed individuals, matters best left unspoken. The Victorian reader, sharp and practiced, understood how to read between lines. It's not unlike modern headlines that hint just enough to spark curiosity without inviting lawsuits. You smile faintly at the familiarity of it. Different century, same dance. There's an unspoken agreement at work, a kind of social contract. The monarchy provides stability, spectacle, and continuity. The press, in return, provides discretion. This doesn't mean there were no scandals, there were plenty. But royal ones required extraordinary momentum to break through. When they did, it was usually because something else had already failed: containment, loyalty, timing. Historians still debate whether this press restraint was a form of respect, fear, or mutual dependency. And the answer shifts depending on which editor you're reading about. You pause by a column filled with moral commentary, long lectures on propriety, family values, and the dangers of excess. The irony doesn't escape you. Newspapers that avoided naming royal affairs had no trouble condemning similar behavior among the middle and lower classes. Respectability, it seems, was applied selectively. Power didn't just shape reality, it shaped which realities were allowed into print. A particularly revealing detail emerges here. Some of the juiciest royal rumors appeared not in Britain at all, but abroad. French and continental papers, less bound by British social contracts, occasionally printed what London would not. These stories drifted back across the Channel, stripped of names, softened by distance. The court noticed, so did the press. Historians still debate how much foreign reporting influenced domestic restraint, but you can sense the quiet irritation it caused. Secrets are harder to manage when they travel. You imagine an editor late at night, staring at a paragraph that could change everything. The facts are solid, the source reliable, and yet, print it. And you risk destabilizing more than a reputation. Don't print it, and you become part of the machine. Most chose the latter, not because they were cowards, but because they understood the ecosystem they lived in. Scandal, in this world, wasn't just news, it was a potential constitutional event. There's a strange calm in that realization. The press wasn't asleep, it was watchful, waiting, recording things that might only matter later. Archives filled quietly, notes were kept. Some stories were saved not for publication, but for leverage, memory, or history. You feel the patience of it all, and it makes you slightly uneasy. Information, when delayed, doesn't disappear, it ages. As you step away from the presses, the murmur softens, the ink dries, the papers fold. Tomorrow's edition will look respectable, informative, and safely incomplete, and yet, you now understand that the silence of the press was not emptiness. It was pressure held in reserve. Ahead, the story begins to stretch beyond Britain altogether, where discretion weakens and comparison sharpens. Other courts, other scandals, other ways of pretending. You move forward knowing that the whispers you've heard so far are about to echo louder, less controllable, as the Victorian world looks at itself through foreign eyes. The rhythm changes as you step forward again. There's a softer sound now, not whispers, not printing presses, but the faint, regular shuffle of paperwork, ledgers, receipts, columns of numbers that look dull enough to lull suspicion to sleep. This is where money lives. And you quickly realize that money, more than silence or denial, is what truly keeps the system running. One solid historical fact grounds you here. The Victorian royal household operated on an intricate web of allowances, stipends, pensions, and discretionary funds. Parliament approved broad budgets. The monarch distributed within them. On paper, it all looked orderly, even boring, but you notice how boredom itself becomes camouflage. Numbers rarely attract moral outrage unless someone insists on reading them closely. You lean over a ledger and feel your eyes glaze just slightly, exactly as intended. Line after line of payments to unnamed recipients. Household expenses, private service, special circumstances. These phrases recur with hypnotic regularity. A lesser-known truth surfaces as you linger. Discretion was often built directly into the financial structure. Certain funds were deliberately vague, designed to be flexible enough to solve problems without asking for explanations. Historians still debate whether this was foresight or opportunism, but the effect is unmistakable. Money moves quietly, but it moves decisively. An inconvenient relationship doesn't need drama if rent is paid elsewhere. A child doesn't need acknowledgement if education and housing are guaranteed. You feel how soothing this must have been for everyone involved. Guilt becomes easier to manage when translated into monthly payments. It's not love, exactly, but it's not abandonment either. It's something in between, and that middle ground is where many Victorian solutions lived. You notice how intermediaries appear everywhere. Solicitors, trusted aides, family friends with impeccable reputations. Rarely does money move directly from royal hand to recipient. Distance preserves dignity. It also protects deniability. If asked, one could always say the arrangement was charitable, administrative, or inherited, which, in a technical sense, might even be true. Historians still debate how often these explanations were sincere versus convenient. But you sense that sincerity and convenience were not mutually exclusive here. There's a strange modern familiarity to it all. Think of non-disclosure agreements, severance packages, consulting fees, different language, same impulse. Financial solutions are attractive because they feel rational, clean, adult. They allow everyone to pretend the situation is resolved, even if the emotional reality lingers unresolved for decades. You pause at a record showing long-term payments, decades. Sometimes, this wasn't hush money in the dramatic sense. It was maintenance, continuity, A recognition that problems don't vanish just because they're quiet. Children grow up, needs change, lives continue. The system planned for that. And in planning for it, it normalized it. One particularly telling detail stands out. Some allowances increased at specific life stages: education, adulthood, marriage. These adjustments mirror legitimate family support. Minus the public acknowledgement, historians still debate whether this reflects genuine paternal concern or simply institutional habit. But the resemblance is hard to ignore. The royal purse, it seems, knew exactly what it was doing. You also notice what's missing. There are no emotional annotations, no justifications, no apologies. Money doesn't explain itself. It doesn't need to. It works best when it simply appears. Regularly, reliably, asking nothing in return except silence. And silence, by now, feels like the most valuable currency of all. As you step back from the ledgers, you feel a mild, almost sleepy discomfort, not outrage, something quieter. The realization that scandal here was not explosive. It was procedural. It lived in systems, not headlines. It was absorbed, amortized, and filed away. The corridor ahead widens again, and with it comes a subtle sense of comparison. You've seen how Britain manages its secrets. Soon, you'll notice how much easier they become to see when reflected elsewhere, across borders, across courts, across cultures that share the same flaws but arrange them differently. You move on, the soft rustle of paper fading behind you, knowing the numbers will keep counting long after everyone involved pretends they never mattered. You feel the air shift again as borders blur. The palace corridors you've grown used to dissolve into salons, embassies, and railway carriages that smell faintly of leather and diplomacy. You're no longer confined to Britain. Now you're moving through Europe, where royal families are tangled together by blood, marriage, and rumor in ways that make secrecy much harder to contain. If Britain preferred to manage scandal quietly, the continent had a habit of reflecting it back with interest. A well-known historical reality anchors this moment. By the Victorian era, Europe's royal houses were deeply interconnected. Queen Victoria herself was related to nearly every major monarch on the continent. Cousins married cousins. Letters crossed borders daily. This closeness meant that private matters rarely stayed private for long. What one court concealed, another politely noticed. And what Britain refused to print, foreign courts sometimes discussed openly over dinner. You imagine a formal gathering in Vienna, Paris, or Berlin. The room sparkles, music plays, everyone smiles with professional warmth. And beneath that surface, information flows effortlessly. A glance exchanged between ambassadors. A comment phrased as concern. "I do hope her health is improving." You already know what that means. A lesser-known truth becomes clear here. Foreign courts often knew more about British royal indiscretions than the British public ever did. Historians still debate how much of this knowledge was used strategically, but it undeniably shaped diplomatic relationships. In France especially, where the press operated under different social expectations, rumors traveled with less restraint. Papers there occasionally hinted at British scandals with a boldness London editors would never attempt. Names might still be softened, but implications were sharper. These stories didn't stay neatly abroad. They drifted back across the channel, translated imperfectly, discussed privately, and quietly resented by those who preferred their secrets domestically managed. You sense the irritation this caused within the British court. It's one thing to keep your own press in line. It's another to watch your carefully curated image refracted through foreign eyes. Comparisons were inevitable. "At least we are not like them," was a common sentiment shared by every court about every other court. The irony, of course, is that they all shared remarkably similar problems. There's a faint humor in how scandal becomes almost competitive here. Whose rumors are worse? Whose illegitimate heirs more inconvenient? Whose moral contradictions more glaring? You can imagine courtiers privately ranking disasters the way modern people compare celebrity scandals, with a mix of judgment and relief that it's happening to someone else. Distance, after all, makes hypocrisy easier to tolerate. One subtle but important detail surfaces as you linger. Foreign royal mistresses and illegitimate children were sometimes treated with more openness than in Britain. Not necessarily kindness, but visibility. Titles could be granted, positions acknowledged. This contrast made British discretion look, from the outside, almost obsessive. Historians still debate whether Britain's approach was uniquely repressive or simply more disciplined. But the contrast is undeniable. You pause on a train platform, feeling the hum of modernity creeping in: steel, steam, speed. Information now travels faster than ever before. A scandal whispered in one capital can be known in another within days. The old methods of containment strain under this pressure. Silence becomes harder to coordinate when borders are crossed regularly and families span nations. And yet, despite all this, the system mostly holds. Letters are written, apologies implied, explanations exchanged. The shared interest in stability keeps everyone cooperative. No one benefits from tearing down the entire structure. Scandal, once again, is absorbed rather than detonated. As you move forward, you realize something important. These foreign reflections don't just reveal British secrets, they sharpen them. Seeing how others manage the same contradictions forces a kind of comparison. And comparison invites doubt. If everyone is pretending, why pretend so hard? That question doesn't yet have an answer. But you can feel it forming. The lights dim slightly as you continue on, carrying with you the awareness that secrecy is easier at home than abroad. And that the next layer of this story will turn inward again, toward marriage itself. The institution designed to legitimize everything you've seen so far. Even as it struggles quietly to contain it, you return inward now, away from embassies and rail lines, back into drawing rooms arranged with almost mathematical precision. Marriage lives here, not romance as you'd recognize it from novels or late-night movies, but marriage as architecture, load-bearing, carefully measured, designed to hold everything else up. In Victorian royal life, marriage wasn't just a personal choice. It was camouflage, strategy, and repair kit all at once. A well-known historical reality settles in immediately. Royal marriages were expected to produce heirs, alliances, and reassurance. Love was optional. Stability was not. You can feel how much pressure radiated from that expectation alone. Every engagement announcement functioned as public proof that order still existed. A ring placed on a finger didn't just promise fidelity, it promised continuity. And continuity, as you've already learned, was the highest value in the room. You watch preparations unfold. Advisors weigh options. Family trees are examined like engineering plans. Who brings money? Who brings land? Who brings silence? A lesser-known truth emerges as you linger. Some marriages were arranged not only to form alliances, but to erase problems. A questionable attachment, a lingering rumor, a child that needed to fade into the background. Marriage could absorb all of it, provided the timing was right. Historians still debate how often this was the primary motivation, but the pattern appears too frequently to ignore. You sense the emotional compression this created. Two people bound together under circumstances that leave very little space for honesty. Some adapted, some withdrew, some sought affection elsewhere. Quietly, predictably, the system didn't expect perfection. It expected discretion. In that sense, marriage wasn't the solution to scandal, it was the container. As long as everything stayed inside it, the outside world remained calm. There's an odd tenderness in certain unions. Despite everything, letters reveal affection growing slowly, cautiously. After duty did its work, others remained cool, efficient partnerships. You notice how often couples appear united in public while living largely separate private lives. Separate bedrooms were not unusual. Separate emotional worlds even less so. Historians still debate whether this distance was a cause or a consequence of infidelity. And you can feel how the answer loops endlessly back on itself. You pause near a wedding portrait, formal, balanced, immaculate. The bride's expression is serene. The groom's posture confident. Nothing here hints at the negotiations that preceded this image. Nothing reveals what the marriage was meant to fix. And yet, everyone involved likely knew, not in detail, but in implication. The point was never to forget the past, only to stabilize the future. A subtle, rarely discussed detail surfaces here. Spouses often became collaborators in discretion. Silence was negotiated, not assumed. Boundaries were understood. Certain topics were simply never raised. Not out of ignorance, but mutual survival. You imagine conversations that never happened. Questions deliberately left unasked. In a world this constrained, omission becomes a form of communication. There's faint, dry humor in this if you allow yourself to see it. Victorian society preached transparency of virtue while perfecting opacity of practice. Marriage manuals spoke of moral unity while lived experience required strategic distance. It's like advertising a minimalist lifestyle from a house full of locked closets. You feel the weight of endurance now. Marriage carried reputations forward even when affection failed. It legitimated heirs, redirected attention, and allowed everyone to pretend that the story had resolved itself. In reality, it merely changed shape. Scandals didn't disappear. They aged, they softened, they waited. As you move on, you realize that marriage, for all its ceremonial weight, was never the end of these stories. It was a pause, a reset, a way to draw a clean line under a mess that still existed above and below it. And as the corridor opens ahead, you sense that time itself is about to press forward, bringing consequences that can no longer be managed by weddings alone. Time moves differently here. You can feel it as you step forward. Like a clock that has been ticking politely in the background suddenly growing louder. The children you sensed earlier, the ones without names, without portraits, are no longer children. They've grown, And adulthood, it turns out, is far less forgiving than infancy when it comes to unfinished truths. A well-established historical fact anchors this moment. Many illegitimate children of royal and aristocratic circles survived into adulthood with education, financial support, and careful placement in society. They did not vanish. They lived, worked, married, and sometimes thrived. What they could not do was fully belong. Legitimacy remained a locked door, visible every day, never quite reachable. You imagine one of them now, standing in a well-appointed study, educated enough to converse easily with the elite, yet always aware of an invisible boundary. They know how to behave, how to speak, how to dress. They may even resemble their parent in ways that make certain rooms uncomfortable. A lesser-known truth emerges here. Resemblance itself could be a liability. Historians still debate how often physical similarity influenced decisions about where these children were placed. But private letters hint at discomfort when likeness became too obvious. Careers become the compromise. Military service, the church, colonial administration, paths that offered purpose, honor, and distance. These roles carried respect without proximity. You can feel how carefully these lives were steered, not just toward opportunity, but away from visibility. It wasn't punishment, it was positioning. Still, the effect could feel the same. Some of these adults maintained quiet contact with their parent. Letters exchanged, meetings arranged under plausible pretenses. Financial support adjusted as circumstances changed. Others experienced abrupt silence when discretion became inconvenient. Historians still debate whether emotional bonds endured more often than they dissolved. But the evidence suggests inconsistency rather than cruelty as the defining feature. Affection existed, so did fear. You sense the emotional complexity pressing in now. Gratitude tangled with resentment, pride mixed with loss. Imagine knowing your success is both enabled and limited by the same source. Every achievement carries an asterisk. Every failure feels heavier, because you cannot afford public mistakes. The freedom to fail, so easily granted to legitimate heirs, is a luxury these adults do not have. There's a faint modern echo here. You think of people today navigating hidden identities, unacknowledged family ties, stories that can't be told at work or online. Different context, same emotional architecture. Victorian discretion created a class of people fluent in restraint. They learned early how to edit themselves. One strange, rarely mentioned detail surfaces as you linger. Some illegitimate heirs were quietly integrated into extended family networks generations later. Not officially, not publicly, but through marriages, friendships, and business ties that closed the distance without naming it. Historians still debate whether this represents reconciliation or convenience. But it suggests that bloodlines have a way of bending back toward themselves over time. You notice how history treats these figures unevenly. Some leave traces, memoirs, descendants, footnotes. Others disappear almost entirely. Their lives reduced to payments in ledgers and cautious phrases in letters. Survival, it seems, was not the same as remembrance. As you move on, you feel the emotional temperature shift again. These grown children are no longer just consequences, they are reminders. Living evidence that discretion has limits. And that time eventually asks questions even silence cannot fully answer. The corridor ahead feels narrower, more reflective, as if inviting judgment, not harsh, but unavoidable. You step forward knowing that the system you've observed has begun to show strain. The cracks aren't loud yet. They don't need to be. They exist in the lives of people who were never meant to be seen. Now standing fully formed in the light of adulthood. And the story, inevitably, turns toward those cracks next. You slow again, almost instinctively, as if the story itself is asking you not to rush. This is where voices multiply, not people this time, but perspectives, scholars, biographers, archivists, generations of historians leaning over the same fragments you've just seen, arguing gently, sometimes fiercely, about what all of this really means. The palace fades into the background, replaced by libraries and footnotes, where certainty is rare and caution is a professional virtue. A familiar historical reality anchors you here. Much of what we know about Victorian royal scandals comes not from clear confessions, but from interpretation. Letters are incomplete, diaries are edited, official records are intentionally vague. You can feel how frustrating this is for anyone trained to want firm answers. And yet, this ambiguity is not a flaw of the system, it is the system. Discretion worked precisely because it avoided leaving definitive proof. You imagine a historian pausing mid-sentence, pen hovering, wondering how far inference can ethically go. If a payment aligns with a birth, is that evidence or coincidence? If a letter's tone shifts, is that emotion or style? A lesser-known truth becomes clear here. Historians often disagree less about facts than about thresholds. How much suggestion equals conclusion? Historians still debate this constantly. And you can sense how each generation redraws the line based on its own values. Some scholars lean toward skepticism, arguing that modern readers project contemporary assumptions onto Victorian relationships. Emotional intimacy, they remind us, did not always mean what we think it means now. Others argue the opposite, that caution itself has historically served power, allowing elites to hide behind ambiguity. You feel the tension between these views, and it hums quietly, like an unresolved chord. There's a faint humor in it too. Entire academic careers built on phrases like may suggest, possibly indicates, and cannot be ruled out. Victorian discretion has outlived the Victorians themselves, embedding uncertainty into the historical record. You smile softly at the idea that even now, the system is still doing its job. You notice how new discoveries periodically stir the debate. A letter found in a private collection. A marginal note overlooked for decades. A financial record reinterpreted with fresh eyes. Each find promises clarity, then delivers complexity instead. The story never quite resolves, it deepens. Historians still debate whether this endless re-examination brings us closer to truth or simply mirrors our own obsession with uncovering it. You feel your own role shifting here, from observer of events to observer of interpretation. The scandals themselves begin to feel less important than how they're remembered. Framed, softened, or sharpened over time. What survives is not just behavior, but narrative, and narratives, once set, are stubborn things. As you move on, the academic voices fade into a low murmur, like conversation heard through walls. You carry with you the understanding that history is not a verdict, it's a negotiation. And the Victorian royals, masters of negotiation in life, have ensured that even in death, their secrets remain just out of reach. Ahead, the tone changes again, less analysis, more consequence. The world you're walking toward no longer believes quite as firmly in the old rules. Morality itself is beginning to strain under the weight of its contradictions. You step forward, aware that the quiet patience of debate is about to give way to something more fragile, the slow cracking of certainty itself. You feel it before you can name it, a subtle loosening. Like fabric beginning to fray after being pulled too tight for too long. The moral certainty that once defined Victorian life is still spoken aloud. Still printed, still preached, but it no longer feels solid. It feels rehearsed. You're standing at the point where the language of virtue starts to sound tired. Even to the people using it. A well-known historical shift anchors this moment, by the late Victorian period. Social confidence in absolute moral authority was weakening. Industrialization had changed daily life. Cities swelled, traditional hierarchies blurred, scientific thinking challenged religious certainty. The rules remained, but belief in them had begun to thin. You can sense how this affected royal scandal, not by making it more common, but by making it harder to ignore. You walk through public spaces now, exhibitions, lecture halls, churches, where morality is discussed openly and passionately. Sermons warn against vice. Essays celebrate family values. The irony feels heavier than before because the gap between ideal and practice has become more visible. A lesser-known truth emerges here. Many Victorians were acutely aware of this contradiction. They weren't naive. They simply believed order mattered more than consistency. Historians still debate how conscious this trade-off was. But private writings suggest it was often acknowledged with weary realism. You notice how satire grows sharper in this period. Cartoons, plays, and novels begin to poke more directly at hypocrisy. Names remain unspoken, but targets are obvious. Respectability becomes something that can be mocked, not just admired. This is new. Humor, once deferential, now carries an edge. You can almost hear the laughter, polite, controlled, but unmistakably knowing. Within the royal sphere, this change manifests quietly. The old methods still function, money moves. Marriages stabilize. Silence holds, but they require more effort. More coordination, more explanation. Scandal feels closer to the surface. Like a crack in ice you can see spreading even if it hasn't broken through yet. You sense how exhausting this must have been for those maintaining the facade. To keep insisting on moral clarity while navigating constant compromise creates a particular kind of fatigue. The system doesn't collapse, it sags. And sagging structures make noise. Not loud enough to panic, but enough to notice. There's a moment now where you compare it, almost unconsciously, to modern life. Public standards that remain high while private behavior grows more complex. Social media profiles that project values polished to a shine. The Victorians, you realize, weren't so different. They simply lacked the comment section. Historians still debate whether this period represents hypocrisy reaching its peak or honesty beginning to break through. You feel both at once. People speak more about morality precisely because they're less certain of it. The repetition becomes a reassurance ritual. Say it often enough, and maybe it will hold. As you move forward, The atmosphere grows thinner, less insulated. The next part of the story won't be about private contradiction anymore, but about what happens when rumors refuse to stay contained, when whispers gain momentum and silence can no longer do all the work. You continue on, aware that the long Victorian night is inching closer to morning, and morning has a habit of revealing things that darkness kept politely hidden. You return, gently, to the center of it all. The palace again, the crown again, but something has changed. The rooms feel more selective now, as if certain doors have quietly closed for good. This is where Queen Victoria herself comes back into focus, not as symbol, not as monument, but as a person making choices about what she is willing and unwilling to see. A well-known historical reality anchors this space. Queen Victoria ruled for so long that her reign became synonymous with an era. She shaped public morality not just through policy, but through example, marriage, motherhood, mourning. Her image mattered intensely, to the nation and to herself. After Prince Albert's death, that image hardened further, turning grief into identity. You can feel how much was invested in maintaining it. You walk beside her now, metaphorically, through years of widowhood, black fabric, routine preserved with near-religious devotion. Publicly, Victoria becomes the embodiment of fidelity beyond the grave. Privately, however, life does not stop asking for negotiation. Court life continues. Relationships form. Dependencies develop. A lesser-known truth surfaces here. Victoria relied deeply on a small circle of trusted individuals, granting them access that blurred professional and personal boundaries. Historians still debate the nature of these relationships, but their emotional intensity is undeniable. You sense her selective attention at work. Some rumors reach her ears and are addressed immediately, efficiently. Others are simply not pursued, not because she is unaware, but because awareness would require action, and action would disrupt stability. In a system built on continuity, ignoring certain truths becomes an act of governance. You feel the weight of that choice settle quietly, like dust on polished furniture. There's a particularly human contradiction here. Victoria could be fiercely moral and deeply pragmatic at the same time. She condemned impropriety loudly in abstract, while navigating it carefully in practice. You imagine the mental compartments required to sustain that balance. Historians still debate whether this represents hypocrisy or survival, but you sense that from her position, it felt like responsibility. You notice how the court learns to read her silences. What she doesn't ask about becomes as important as what she does. Advisors steer information accordingly. Problems are solved before they require her opinion. This isn't deception so much as anticipation. The machine has learned its operator. A faint, almost tender irony surfaces here. The woman who defined an era of moral certainty did so partly by choosing not to see everything clearly. Her blind spots were not accidental, they were protective. Protective of the crown, of memory, of herself, and perhaps of a nation that needed its symbols intact more than it needed complete honesty. You pause, feeling a softness enter the narrative. This is no villain, no mastermind. It's a person aging inside an institution too large to be honest all at once. You sense loneliness here, buffered by ritual, authority, buffered by habit, and grief, buffered by control. As you move on, the palace seems quieter. older. The decisions made here don't shout, they ripple. And those ripples carry forward into rumor, into memory, into the long shadow Victoria leaves behind. You understand now that what remains unseen can shape history as powerfully as what is declared. Ahead, you sense motion again, not inward this time, but outward. The blind spots you've just passed through are about to collide with something more persistent than policy or ritual. Rumor itself. The kind that doesn't need confirmation to survive. You step forward, aware that silence is losing its edge. You hear it before you see it, the sound of repetition. Not loud, not urgent, just steady. A phrase repeated often enough to feel true. This is where rumor lives. Not as an explosion, not as a headline, but as a habit. You've already felt it brushing past you in corridors and salons. Now it gathers shape, persistent and oddly calm, like a clock that keeps ticking no matter how many times someone tries to muffle it. A well-known historical reality anchors this moment. Victorian society thrived on gossip while publicly condemning it. Rumor was treated as vulgar, yet consumed endlessly. It moved faster than letters, slipped through class boundaries, and survived precisely because it was never officially acknowledged. You sense how rumors about royal affairs followed this pattern, never confirmed, never erased. They simply circulated, changing form but never disappearing. You walk through spaces where no one is supposed to be listening. Yet everyone is. A tea table, a carriage ride, a waiting room before an audience. The same names surface again and again. Always with slight variation. A raised eyebrow replaces a sentence. A pause replaces a fact. A lesser-known truth becomes clear here. Rumor gained strength from restraint. The less explicitly something was said, the more durable it became. Historians still debate whether this made rumors less harmful or more powerful. But their longevity suggests effectiveness. What fascinates you is how rumor doesn't need proof. It needs plausibility. And by now, plausibility is everywhere. You've seen the structures, money, silence, arrangements. Rumor fits neatly into them like the final piece of a puzzle no one admits to completing. Once that happens, denial loses urgency. Why deny what no one is officially accusing you of? You notice how rumor begins to outlive its original subjects. People who were once at the center fade away. But the stories remain, retold without names, then with new ones. There was a time, it was said that, each retelling smooths the edges, making the story easier to carry and harder to disprove. Historians still debate how much weight to give these recurring whispers. But the pattern itself is evidence of something unresolved. There's a faint, almost sleepy irony to it. Rumor doesn't shout, it hums. It settles into the background noise of society. Like traffic you stop consciously hearing but would miss if it vanished. For the Victorian royals, rumor became part of the environment, annoying, manageable, and ultimately unavoidable. You compare it, briefly, to modern life, trending topics that fade and return, stories everyone knows, without ever reading the source. The technology has changed, but the human appetite hasn't. Victorian rumor required patience, today's just moves faster. The emotional mechanics are identical. As you move on, you feel the persistence of these whispers trailing behind you. They don't accuse, they don't conclude, they simply endure. And endurance, you're beginning to realize, is more destabilizing than scandal. Scandal burns bright and dies. Rumor waits. Ahead, the path opens into reflection. The era itself is nearing its end. And with it comes the urge to look back, to reinterpret, to judge, to compare. The whispers you've just passed through won't disappear with time. They'll follow the story forward, shaping how everything that came before is remembered. You step into a quieter, brighter space now, not brighter with gaslight or chandeliers, but with distance. Time has passed. The Victorian era is no longer lived, it is observed. You're standing in the modern gaze, looking back at old rooms through cleaned glass. And the effect is strangely disorienting. Everything feels clearer, yet somehow less certain. A well-known historical reality anchors this shift. Later generations reassessed Victorian morality with skepticism, irony, and, occasionally, fascination. What once passed as unquestioned virtue now invites analysis. What was hidden now feels implied. You sense how the distance of time loosens restraint. People ask questions that would once have been unthinkable, not because they are braver, but because the consequences are finally manageable. You notice how modern readers approach the same letters, ledgers, and silences you've already seen, but with different instincts. They look for patterns, for psychology, for motive. A lesser-known truth surfaces here. Interpretation often reveals as much about the present as the past. Historians still debate whether modern frameworks clarify Victorian behavior or distort it. And you can feel how easily certainty slides into projection. You imagine a contemporary reader encountering a discreet allowance, a carefully edited letter, a euphemism like change of air. The meaning feels obvious now. Too obvious, perhaps. There's a temptation to flatten complexity into simple scandal, to retrofit modern expectations onto lives shaped by very different constraints. You catch yourself doing it, just a little, and gently pull back. There's a faint humor here as well. The Victorians worked so hard to appear moral, and now they are remembered largely for what they tried to hide. It's like curating a flawless profile only to be known decades later for the outtakes. The irony isn't cruel, it's human. Image ages poorly. Behavior, it turns out, is more durable. You sense how this re-evaluation changes legacy. Royal figures once remembered primarily for duty and decorum acquire footnotes, then paragraphs, then entire books about their private lives. Bloodlines matter less now than stories. Illegitimate heirs become symbols of repression rather than embarrassment. Silence becomes evidence. Historians still debate whether this shift is corrective or voyeuristic, but it's undeniably powerful. You pause and notice how gently judgment enters. Not outrage, not condemnation, just a raised eyebrow across a century. Modern eyes don't demand perfection, they demand coherence. And Victorian morality, when examined closely, rarely provides it. That doesn't make the people monstrous. It makes them legible. There's a soft comparison humming underneath it all. You think of how future generations might read us, our own compromises, our own silences, our own carefully managed images. That thought has a calming effect. History, you realize, is less a courtroom than a mirror. It reflects patterns, not verdicts. As you move on, the air grows calmer still. The story is no longer uncovering secrets, it's absorbing them. The scandals you've followed don't shock anymore. They settle into understanding, and that understanding prepares you for the final movement, where meaning matters more than detail. And where the long Victorian night finally begins to fade. Your pace slows naturally now, as if the story itself is easing you toward rest. The sharp edges you felt earlier, rumor, contradiction, secrecy, have softened. What remains isn't shock, or even curiosity, but something more reflective. This is where legacy takes over. Not bloodlines alone, not titles, but the residue left behind once the people themselves are gone. A well-known historical reality anchors this moment. Dynasties survive less by purity than by narrative. Official histories remember continuity, stability, and succession. The Victorian royal family succeeded spectacularly at this. Empires expanded, institutions endured, and the crown outlived every scandal that threatened to unsettle it. From a structural point of view, the system worked. You can feel how tempting it is to stop the analysis right there. But then there's everything underneath. The lives that never quite fit into genealogies. The children supported but unnamed. The relationships acknowledged only through money, distance, or silence. A lesser-known truth settles gently now. These hidden stories didn't weaken the dynasty. In many ways, they stabilized it, by absorbing personal disruption quietly. The institution preserved its public shape. Historians still debate whether this makes the system pragmatic or morally compromised. And you sense how both answers can coexist without canceling each other out. You imagine history as it's usually taught, clean timelines, portraits, dates, bloodlines traced neatly from one monarch to the next. And then you imagine all the invisible threads running alongside those lines. Never quite touching them, yet always influencing their direction. Legacy, you realize, is not just inheritance, it's accumulation of choices, of omissions, of things deliberately left unfinished. There's a strange tenderness in that thought. These scandals were never meant to be remembered, yet they shaped how remembrance itself works. They taught institutions how to survive human behavior. They taught families how to love partially, publicly, and sometimes at a distance. They taught power how to bend without breaking. You notice how modern interest gravitates toward these margins, not because they're more scandalous, but because they're more human. The official story tells you what endured. The unofficial one tells you how. And often, how is the more intimate answer. You feel a soft humor drift through the reflection. All that effort to control legacy. And here you are, centuries later, gently entangling it anyway. Not to expose, not to accuse, just to understand. The Victorians might have hated that idea. Or perhaps they would have accepted it as inevitable. After all, they understood systems better than most. As you take one more slow step forward, you sense the story preparing to close, not with resolution, but with reassurance. Nothing here demands outrage. Nothing here asks you to take sides. It simply asks you to notice how complicated endurance can be, and how institutions often survive not because they are pure, but because they are adaptable. The final room waits ahead, quiet and dim, where meaning softens into mood, and history loosens its grip just enough to let you rest. You arrive without ceremony. No doors swing open, no announcement is made. The space simply widens, and the noise you've been carrying all this way, whispers, debates, echoes, begins to thin. This is the end of the Victorian corridor, where footsteps fade and meaning becomes softer than fact. A well-known historical truth settles here gently. The Victorian age did not end because its contradictions were resolved. It ended because time moved on. New generations inherited old systems, adjusted them, renamed them, and carried forward what still functioned. The scandals you've followed were not erased, they were absorbed into memory, filed under complex, and left there to rest. You look back, slowly, at everything you've passed, the polished rooms, the silences, the children without names, the letters that survived fire and editing. None of it feels sharp anymore. Distance has done what outrage never could. It has quieted the story without denying it. A lesser-known truth becomes clear in this stillness. History rarely closes chapters cleanly. It just lowers its voice. Historians still debate where the Victorian moral project truly failed or succeeded. But here, at the end, the argument feels less important than the pattern. You sense how these royal scandals now function more like shadows than events. They stretch long, but they don't move. They remind rather than accuse. And in that way, they've become strangely harmless, not because they didn't matter, but because they've already done their work. They shaped behavior. They shaped systems. They shaped how power learned to survive being human. Your breathing slows. The comparisons to modern life feel less urgent now. You don't need them anymore. The story has already made its point without insisting on it. Perfection was never real. Respectability was always managed. And yet, life continued. Children grew up. Empires adapted. People loved imperfectly and carried on. The lights dim further, not suddenly. But the way evening fades when you're not paying attention. You feel reassured, not because everything turned out well, but because nothing here demands resolution. The past doesn't need you to fix it. It only asks to be acknowledged, then allowed to sleep. Your thoughts begin to blur at the edges. Details loosening their grip. Names matter less now than atmosphere. Dates soften into rhythm. The palace, the papers, the rumors, all of it recedes into a low, steady hum, like distant traffic or wind through tall buildings. You're safe to let go. History will remain where it belongs. Behind you, intact without your attention. Your only task now is rest. The voices fade. The corridors empty. The Victorian night exhales one last time. End of script. Sweet dreams.